Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. 15 years ago, right now, I started my adventure, explication, surprise, broadcasting to this audience in New York and nationally at the time about the attack on New York and Washington 15 years ago on the 12th of September, 2001. My colleague and I, Paul Alexander, had done a show several days before, Saturday night, about the attack on the USS Cole in October of 2000. That attack had not been yet solved by the FBI, who were investigating it as a crime scene. We spoke to the admiral of the fleet in charge of the USS Cole during the attack, and he voiced his opinion on Saturday night, the 8th of September, that there was progress being made. That was the first time I ever heard and spent time talking about an organization called Al-Qaeda. That was September 8th. And I learned a man's name, Bin Laden. I did not know it. Bin Laden had been well known to those dealing with counterterrorism for several years. It was new to me. Several days later, the attack on New York, and then I was asked to go on air on the 12th until things were figured out broadcasting. We had our tower in New York because it had not been moved to the World Trade Center. Many of the broadcast towers had been moved there. So we were on the Empire State Building and kept broadcasting. And what I found over the next few days is that a whole lot of people were listening to me because there were other radio stations in New York down, and stations around the country had joined in to listen to what was like in New York in those days after the attack. I learned a lot that week and the weeks after, but now it's 15 years later. And what I've learned is to count on my colleagues who do this very carefully every day. I do not. I have a range of topics. Tonight, in fact, I'll talk about the JFK tax cuts. So I spend a lot of time moving through the field of American history. However, Tom Joscelyn and his colleague Bill Raggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, they keep the Long War Journal, and they keep their eye on the events of 9/11 that introduced us to the world of Al-Qaeda. That's right. I'm emphasizing Al-Qaeda here. I know the presidential campaign these days spends all of its time talking about this creature called ISIS. On the videos, their horrors, their brutality, their sadism. But Al-Qaeda is what Tom and Bill watch particularly. We'll mention ISIS tonight, but Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden's gone. I was in Poland the night we learned of his death, his exit from this earthly coil, and I broadcast from Poland. It was odd. Bin Laden was gone. What had changed? What I've learned since 2011, and thanks to Tom and Bill, I've followed it carefully, is that Al-Qaeda has grown. It is not what we were led to believe with bin Laden's death, in retreat, hiding away in what you'd have to say peculiar circumstances in Pakistan. No, Al-Qaeda is a global and extremely dangerous organization. Tom, a very good evening to you. 15 years after I started broadcasting with the towers burning, we have a very good understanding of what Al-Qaeda is. You describe it in your piece in the Long War Journal. I want to begin because all organizations need masters, need bosses. I want to begin with the Egyptian national Zawahiri. Who is he today, and what has he built? Good evening to you, Tom.
Well, good evening, John. Yes, Ayman al-Zawahiri, I estimate, is probably the most underrated jihadi of all time. When he took over for Osama bin Laden in 2011, there was a lot of reporting, this meme sort of trafficked through the press saying that basically Zawahiri he lacked bin Laden's charisma, and he wasn't a very capable leader, and he's somebody who wasn't really going to be able to shepherd Al-Qaeda forward in bin Laden's absence. All of that was totally wrong. Zawahiri is a guy who's still standing. He's someone who's been hunted by intelligence services around the globe since the 80s, John. Remember, this is a guy who was imprisoned after the assassination of Anwar Sadat all the way back in the early 1980s. He's been a known quantity to intelligence services, counterterrorism forces around the globe since then. And yet he's been constantly underestimated. I mean, if you think about it, John, we're sitting here in 2016. Imagine being known by all these different spooks around the globe, everywhere from Egypt to the U.S., to Europe, to Pakistan, elsewhere. and be hunted for that many years, decades now, and to still be alive and still be in control of forces in various different countries. It's pretty amazing, actually, pretty remarkable. And I think this is a guy who's a remarkable evil genius, in fact. And so to this day, Zawahiri now is in charge of al-Qaeda. And as I say in this piece in the Long War Journal, everyone said, well, Zawahiri was not going to be able to replace Osama bin Laden, and people will cite the rise of the Islamic State and the fact that that Al Qaeda had to disown the Islamic State, and that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of the Islamic State, disobeyed Zawahiri's orders and broke off to form his own new global jihadist menace. That's all entirely true. The Islamic State has cut into Al Qaeda's market share and has challenged Al Qaeda's authority in the jihadist world. Absolutely, we carefully document that at the Long War Journal as well. But something interesting happened in the wake of the Islamic State's rebellion against al-Qaeda's authority. After that, after al-Qaeda disowns them in 2014, Zawahiri helps build the largest paramilitary force for al-Qaeda in its history, a standing guerrilla army of 10,000 men in Syria, known as Al-Nusra Front, and now known as the the Conquest of the Levant Front. And this is quite a remarkable achievement. So even in the face of this massive challenge from the Islamic State, al-Qaeda today has a standing paramilitary army in Syria. And he's not given enough credit for doing what he did to actually build that army, and it's very dangerous. But around the globe, John, if you look at the piece, I document that the story in each country is a little bit different, but what you still have to this day are these arms or branches of al-Qaeda that are openly loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri everywhere from West and North Africa through the Arabian Peninsula into the heart of the Levant and all the way into South Asia. And this is a very deadly global organization which is carrying on insurgencies in multiple countries. And I think that to this day, you talked about coming on the radio the night after 9/11 15 years ago. Well, the most remarkable thing, John, is that here as we are 15 years later, this organization is still not well understood. It's still not, there's not been enough resources, I think, publicly put into understanding how it's structured, how it works, and how it's been growing. And so we still, I think, this long after 9/11, still have a looming al-Qaeda threat.
The new recruits, where are they coming from? Are they regionally based? Do they come from everywhere? Or are they like the Islamic State? They drag them out through social media. How do they do it, Tom?
They definitely recruit foreign fighters and drag people out through social media, not to the extent the Islamic State really, I think, dominates that part of the jihadi market, what I call the hothead part of the market. They get a lot of the young guys to come on board, probably much better than Al-Qaeda does, but Al-Qaeda does some of that as well. But Al-Qaeda's plan is I think, more sinister in the long run. What they're trying to do and what they have been doing is inculcating their jihadist ideology in these local populations. So what they want to do is they want to convert local forces, local people to Al-Qaeda's cause. And this is what they've been doing in Syria, Yemen, North Africa, Libya, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere.
That describes Shabaab perfectly in East Africa. They flipped what was a nationalist or indigenous rebellion into an Al-Qaeda service.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say it was flipped. They groomed it, because what happened with Shabaab was a good example of this is that, I'm proud of my colleague Bill Roggio. Actually, in August 2010, he reported that bin Laden already considered Shabaab to be part of al-Qaeda, a regional branch of al-Qaeda, but he told Shabaab to keep that on the down low. He didn't want Shabaab to announce that, in fact, it was al-Qaeda. And after bin Laden's files were recovered during the raid that killed him in May 2011, some of the files that came out documented that just 1 week before Bill reported that, bin Laden had sent the letter to Shabaab saying, don't announce that you're al-Qaeda. Of course you're al-Qaeda. We're building our emirate there in East Africa, and you're leading the charge, but don't say you're al-Qaeda for various strategic and tactical reasons. And that's basically how al-Qaeda works. What they're doing is they're grooming these local insurgency organizations, local forces in various different countries to their cause, to the ideology, and they think that gives them stronger roots in the long run. It makes it much harder to root out. I mean, if you think about it, in Syria today, this is the best case example, I think, of this.
This is al-Nusra in Syria.
Right, and this is what I would consider purebred al-Qaeda. In Syria, what they've done is they've positioned themselves as the true defenders of the Syrian people against Assad, against Russia. They're trying to make America out to be the grand enemy of the Syrian people as well. And so what they've done is they position themselves as this popular revolutionary force against all these bad actors who were trying to oppress and kill Sunni Muslims in Syria. Well, that's a very compelling message, and it opens up a very big window for them to then usher in their ideological beliefs and convert the population to the jihadi cause. And they've been doing this. You know, if you go back to June of 28th, Brett McGurk, who's the head of the special envoy for the anti-ISIL coalition, he testified before the Senate, and he said that they're setting up schools and they're setting up all these indoctrination camps and training camps, and they're basically that this is the largest formal al-Qaeda affiliate in history and answering directly to Ayman al-Zawahiri. Well, that doesn't sound like an organization that's on death's door to me, John. You know, we've heard for years Al-Qaeda's on the run, and, you know, basically Zawahiri and his lieutenants are huddled in the cave somewhere waiting to be droned to death. The truth is quite the opposite, that, in fact, they've been on the march, and they've basically been building and raising their armies. And I think this is something, unfortunately, we're going to be dealing with for some time to come.
Does Al-Qaeda remain a transnational threat similar to what we saw, say, in the first year of the Obama administration when the attempt was made in Detroit to bomb an aircraft? Is that still part of Al-Qaeda's protocol?
You know, I'm going to put my cards on the table here, John. And what you could see is on September 10th, the Washington Post ran an account basically quoting people saying that Al-Qaeda was no longer the transnational threat that it was on 9/11. On September 11th, I ran my account, the Long War Journal, where I said the opposite, where I said that, in fact, Al-Qaeda is still a transnational threat, and the threat of a large-scale plot in the West looms. Al-Qaeda, and this is what's really hard for people to understand, Al-Qaeda is not as obsessed with striking the U.S. as a lot of people in the West think it is. And in fact, Zawahiri, this is well documented, Zawahiri gave stand-down orders to his guys in Syria at one point, saying, you know what, we've got the picture here in Syria is we want to overthrow Assad, and we don't want to complicate that fight by lashing out the West from Syria. We can hit the West from Syria if we want to, but we're not going to do that right now, Zawahiri said, because we think that will complicate the fight for us. And I think that sort of strategic calculation is not really appreciated. This is not an organization that lacks the capability of hitting in the West in a big time. I think it's just an organization that's decided at the moment it wasn't tactically in its interest. Now, that calculation can change at any time, and of course, Al-Qaeda can come at us from any number of different angles.
Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Tom and Bill and their colleagues keep the Long War Journal. When we come back, we will attend to the Islamic State and its suicide attacks just this year, and its ambition 15 years after the attack on New York and Washington. We'll also mention al-Qaeda work in Yemen, the civil war of Yemen. I'm John Batchelor.